Raise the flag.
Light the cauldron.
We declare the Games Odyssey open. Welcome to the Games Odyssey podcast, your home for stories of glory from the Olympics and Paralympics. I'm Jonathan Jordan.
And I'm Sarah Patton. We both love the Olympic and Paralympic Games, and we love history. But most of all, we love Olympic and Paralympic history.
From the epic and inspirational moments we all love, to the more bizarre and controversial moments, we're fascinated by it all.
Which is why we are on a journey through all of the Olympic and Paralympic Games, from the ancient Olympics held at Olympia, all the way to now.
Welcome back to all our fellow Olympic and Paralympic history nerds. We're here to kick off season 2, highlighting the 7th Olympiad that was held in Antwerp, Belgium. But first, how are you doing, Sarah?
Doing okay. I feel like it's been kind of a wild summer for us, which, yes, if you're listening to this, we kind of took a little bit of a summer break, but yeah, doing okay. Feel like we've had some fun sports to keep us entertained over the summer, like the World Championships for athletics. Got to see a lot of cool track and field, and that was held in the United States for the first time, so that was quite exciting. But yeah, doing okay. Not to just out all my stuff, but after 2.5 years of running from COVID, it finally got me. So that knocked me out for a few weeks, but happy to be back in the saddle, and at least we got some immunity going. So, it was fine. We were fortunate that we had minor symptoms in our family, and just, it was more annoying than anything. So if that's the worst that COVID hits us, then that's great. So just hanging out and have some exciting things coming up, but we'll talk about that at a future time. How are you?
Yeah, doing well. We did not get COVID. And it was it was awfully kind of COVID to wait until we had a recording break. So, just kidding. I hate that it happened for you. But glad that you are on the mend. And yeah, in the break that we had, there were some pretty wild things that happened, such as our Jim Thorpe episode already being out of date, which that was a fun thing to happen with him being fully reinstated as the sole gold medalist for pentathlon and decathlon for 1912. So that was a fun bit of news to come out during the break. And it just kind of seems like a lot of things were going on between, as you said, the World Track and Field Championships, the World Games, the Commonwealth Games, all the games apparently happening. Yeah,
you have European Championships of various sports going on. So it's been a lot to keep up with. So I know if you're an Olympic or Paralympic fan, maybe you've been busy watching cool things on TV. So,
yeah. And I have to admit that this break was really busy for me. So I didn't really actually get to watch any of those things. The way that I watched them was on Instagram. That's how I watched
Such a millennial.
Yeah, definitely. But again, we're going to kind of circle back to, with us getting back on track with season 2, there are going to be a couple of small format changes that listeners may notice. Nothing too out of the ordinary, though. But one of those is that we're going to be starting off each one of these episodes. We're going to start off our discussions with a little bit of an overview of what we'll talk about in the episode before we even get into the highlights. It just kind of felt like that was something that would help set the stage a little bit more. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and give a little bit of an overview of where we're going in the episode, and then we'll jump into some highlights. So after the devastation of World War I, the Olympic movement finds itself at a crossroads, especially in Europe. While the 6th Olympiad was supposed to take place in Berlin, Germany, it had been banned from participation as politics was interjected into the Olympic Games. So now the IOC must decide where to hold the 7th Olympiad, and Antwerp is chosen to play host with less than 2 years to prepare. To this day, the Antwerp Games of 1920 are the only time the Games have been hosted in Belgium and would be the last single Olympic Games before being split into winter and summer editions. And so, as we get into our topic today, we're affectionately calling these the comeback games. So, Sarah, take it away and let's get into some highlights.
All right. Also, I love that they're called the comeback games because it's like the comeback kid, and we love a comeback story. Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, if that's not in the Olympic spirit, I don't know what is. So going into the highlights, some highlights of Antwerp 1920, or Antwerpen 1920, if you will. The games were held in Antwerp, Belgium from April 20th to September 12th. There were 2,622 athletes from 29 nations competing across 156 events. Of the 29 participating nations, 7 were new to the Olympics, including Estonia, Czechoslovakia, though Bohemia, a region of the country, had participated previously, Argentina, Yugoslavia, which included the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, Brazil, Monaco. New Zealand competed independently for the first time, though it had been a part of the Australasian team that we've mentioned in a previous episode. Also, the Olympic program for 1920 would feature a couple of winter sports, including the debut of the ice hockey tournament, which was held from April 23rd through the 30th. And we had the return of figure skating to the program after being cut from 1912. So we'll see how with these 2 winter sports, there's a growing need for a separate games just to focus on winter events.
Before we get into that, Sarah, we're headed to Belgium in this episode. So have you ever been to Belgium?
I have not been to Belgium.
Okay.
I will say that one time I almost went to Belgium for getting on the wrong train accidentally, but the train stopped before it got to Belgium.
Okay.
But perhaps I just should have stayed on so I could say I'd gone. But no, I've not officially been to Belgium. What about you?
Okay. I have actually been to Belgium. It is the only place that I have been in Europe. And it happened because I was on a trip to Africa. And on the way back, we had to have a layover in Belgium, in Brussels. So I've not been to Antwerp, but I have been to Brussels. It was a 7-hour layover. And even though the lady in the airport told me it wasn't a good idea, of course, I left the airport, got on a train, and went into the city so I could officially say, I wanted to officially say I had been to Europe because the airport doesn't count. Okay. In my opinion, at least. So I got on the train. I went into Brussels. I went to this really cool city square, got out for a couple hours, just kind of walked around, bought some chocolates, of course, because that's what you have to do when you're in Belgium. Brought them back for my wife. And then when I returned to the airport, I had a Belgian waffle to complete the experience. So that was my Belgium experience.
But, I mean, it sounds pretty great to me. So good for you.
But obviously no visiting of Olympic sites since I wasn't even in the correct city for that. All right. So on that note, let's go ahead and take a break. And then we're going to come back and talk about the story of how the games ended up in Antwerp. So we'll be right back. So how did the Olympic Games end up in Antwerp for 1920? Well, during the 13th session of the IOC in 1912, Baron Edouard de Lavallee, president of the Belgian Olympic Committee, put in a bid for Belgium to host in 1920, but no host city was actually selected during that meeting. Now, as we mentioned before, Berlin was supposed to host in 1916, but the 6th Olympiad was canceled due to the outbreak of World War I. After the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, the losing nations were sanctioned by the Allied nations, meaning they were banned from participating in the Olympics. This included the nations of Germany, Hungary, Austria, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. In 1915, Lyon, France considered a bid shortly, but they decided to support Antwerp's bid if Antwerp still wanted the Games after the war was over. There were also some considerations from Cleveland, Philadelphia, and Atlanta over here in the US, and also Havana, Cuba considered, but none of these were actual bids. Ultimately, the IOC decided they would give Antwerp dibs. According to Olympics.com, the Games were awarded to Antwerp in honor of the affliction that had been faced by the Belgian people during the war. After all, Belgium is right between Germany and France, so yeah, things got messy there, to say the least. Antwerp had less than 2 years to actually prepare. In fact, an executive committee was only formed in April of 1919. The event program was published only 6 months before the Games were scheduled to start. The stadium was still unfinished when the Games began. The track in particular was in bad shape and it got muddy throughout the Games. We're going to come back to that in a few minutes. The athletes' quarters were crowded with about 15 or 16 competitors having to share a room and sleeping mostly on cots. The organizers hadn't been able to build a pool for the swimming event, so instead, a large wooden box was made and then placed in an existing waterway, the city's ancient canal, and that was what would serve as the pool. The food provided for the athletes consisted of a roll and coffee for breakfast, and then a roll and sardines for lunch due to food shortages. In fact, athletes really just had to pay for their own food. Turnout for the Games was very low since most people couldn't afford tickets. Toward the end of the Games, in fact, students were allowed to attend for free, and the Games put Belgium into the hole by 600 million is it francs or francs? It's one of the two. It doesn't exist anymore. Now we have euros. Either way, it was a lot of money. In fact, the organizing committee went bankrupt and military officials had to be brought in to help organize and stage the events. Finances and transportation problems made it difficult for many teams to even travel to the Games. For example, even Team USA only arrived in time because of a last-minute military transport that was made available to bring them over. Also, you have to keep in mind, this was in the middle of the Spanish flu pandemic of 1920. Sound familiar, anyone?
Don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, we'll just leave it at that. So, as you can imagine, that probably had an effect on attendance too. Even though the worst wave of the Spanish flu had subsided in Europe, it was still popping up in the news, and so people were concerned about a resurgence and new outbreaks happening. And if that's not enough, on top of all of that, there was a global recession happening at the time because of the war, so a lot of governments just didn't have the money to spend on sending as many athletes as the IOC would have hoped for. But still, the Games had about 200 more athletes than Stockholm did, even with the recession and the exclusion of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. So, all in all, the numbers still were technically an improvement over the previous Games. Oh, and also this, we kind of have to throw this in because it explains a couple of things we'll come back to later on. But in 1917, the October Revolution had happened, which ended the Russian Empire and led to the formation of the Soviet Union, which at that time decided not to participate in the Olympics. But again, they're going to change their mind about that later on, which will be a frequent topic of conversation looking ahead of, a couple of years. There was also a debate, especially in British newspapers, about whether the Olympic Games should even continue at all. One writer actually called them a farce in the wake of the Great War, saying that the ideal of international peace had failed. And that article even went so far as to say that the British shouldn't even fund a team for 1920. Now, British officials countered this, saying 1920 Antwerp actually offered the world a chance to show that peace will always prevail and that the war hadn't broken the spirit of the affected nations. Okay, that that was a lot. So yeah, Sarah, any of these problems sound familiar to you?
Oh my goodness, where to begin? Well, if you're listening to this in the way distant future, it is currently 2022, and we are, as I said earlier, after avoiding COVID for 2.5 years, it finally got me. So yes, we're 2.5 years into a pandemic as we're recording this, and so the pressures of a pandemic and trying to keep the Olympics going, and of course, there have been a lot of people saying that the 2021 Tokyo Games, which were rescheduled from 2020, and the 2022 Beijing Games should not have been done at all. So we've heard this, and of course, there's been chaos between Russia and Ukraine, and there's just a lot here to unpack. And then ultimately, there's always strife, there's always chaos and war, unfortunately, and there's always people that think there's reasons not to continue the Olympics. So I feel like talking about these things hits a little closer to home for us than maybe some of the other Olympic games that we've discussed up until now. What do you think?
Yeah, well, so what was interesting when I started the research for these games was at first I was really worried we weren't going to have enough to talk about. And then as I dug into it more, there was a moment where I thought to myself, wait, am I researching 1920 right now or 2020? Because there were so many things that felt familiar. And I heard this quote recently, but so I don't know who exactly said it. But I love this quote that said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I felt like that's exactly what's happening here. As 100 years later, we have some of these themes in history, not exactly repeating, but rhyming. So, you know, it's one of those things where we're going to have similar problems pop up time and time again. And one of the things I love about the Olympic Games is it feels like it gives us an anchor that we can hold on to when these problems come up again. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah. The last bullet point that you talked about, how British officials said that Antwerp offered the world a chance to show that peace would prevail and spirits had not been broken. It reminds me of the 2022 opening ceremony when it was officially declared that the new Olympic motto is faster, higher, stronger, together. And so in a similar way, I feel like people were trying to use the Olympics. People who were pro-Olympics have been trying to say, hey, even in a pandemic, we're in this together. It's affected the entire world. And I just, it feels very familiar. And now it's officially part of the Olympic motto. So
yeah. Absolutely. Well, speaking of opening ceremonies, let's go ahead and chat a little bit about the opening ceremony for 1920 and some of the venues that were there. So what did that look like, Sarah?
The Olympic Games were officially opened at Beerschot Stadium by King Albert during the opening ceremony on August 14th. It was the first time the Olympic flag with the 5 rings was raised during the opening ceremony. Yes, it was the debut of the iconic 5 rings. It was also the first time the Olympic oath was administered and first time doves were released as a sign of peace. The opening ceremony also featured a religious ceremony to honor athletes who had been killed or injured during the war, since many star athletes had been involved in the conflict and either been lost or could not compete due to injuries. Fun fact, boxing and wrestling were contested at the Antwerp Zoo. Sounds pretty wild, right?
Yeah, just a little bit. So, okay. So having boxing and wrestling at the zoo, that kind of gets me thinking. Sarah, which animal do you think is the most Olympic animal? And no, this is not a mascot question, okay?
Okay, but I do love mascots. I'm inclined to say anything that's in the water that goes fast because I think about swimming. So I'm inclined to say like a a fish that's really fast. I mean, I know that there was that whole thing a couple of years ago where people were like, "Oh, could Michael Phelps beat a shark?" That,
Yeah.
or I'm going to say like a monkey doing gymnastics because I love watching them swing around when we go to the zoo. So I guess I'm torn on those two. What about you?
So my initial thought was running and jumping. So I thought of something like a gazelle, right? But then my brain also went back to boxing, since that was what was held at the zoo. And I thought about how sometimes back then you would see these contests of, again, this is not from an animal rights perspective, this is not good or right. But you know how people used to box kangaroos? How that used to be a thing that would happen. Yeah. So my thought kind of goes to, well, they could have had kangaroos, I guess, at the zoo doing the boxing as well. So there's that. But that's where my brain goes with animals in the Olympics.
I like it.
Yeah. But of course, we do have animals in the Olympics. We have horses in the equestrian events. So that probably should have been the first thing we thought of. but
you would think. You would think. I guess it's because we think about the horses getting flowers while their people get medals. So, but yeah, I'd say horses are Olympians. Oh man, sorry to the horse community.
Yeah, all the horses who are our listeners, we apologize. We did not think of you first. Okay. But we're talking about you now. So yeah, so we do have animal Olympians, I guess. But on that note, we're not going to horse around anymore, and we're going to take another quick break, and then we're going to come back and get into some of the participants and some of the events. Okay. All right. So after our little animal debacle that we just had, let's talk about people. Maybe we'll be a little bit better about talking about who showed up to the Olympics and what they did there. And so let's kick it off talking about the women at the Olympics, because Sarah, this was the first time that the U.S. sent female swimmers, and they were dubbed by many as quote unquote mermaids. And no, that wasn't exactly meant in a good way. Male spectators seem to be more interested in the women's appearances than their athletic skill. And aren't you glad that things have changed so much since then? And yes, that's sarcasm, just in case you couldn't pick it up.
Yeah, still an issue, but not for today's discussion.
Yeah. So before 1920, let's back up a little bit and explain why the U.S. hadn't sent female swimmers at the previous games. So there was actually a dress code for women swimmers in the U.S. requiring them to wear full-length outfits with skirts, which obviously you can imagine how well that goes when swimming. In fact, during one marathon swimming event that was held in New York, where swimmers had to go from Manhattan to Coney Island, the dress code actually caused some of the female competitors to drown when their outfits got snagged by things that were underwater. So obviously that's incredibly sad and tragic and could have been completely avoided, right? That's needless to say. So in light of this tragedy, the U.S. Olympic Committee decided to relax their rules with the dress code. And so finally, the mermaids were sent to the Antwerp Games. And how did they do, Sarah?
They did pretty well. They won 7 medals across the 3 women's events, including sweeping the 100 meter and 300 meter freestyle swim. The golds for the 100 meter and 300 meter were both won by Ethilda Leibtree, who also broke the world record in those events. She was considered the team captain and had been called the world's greatest women swimmer by the New York Times. We have more to say about Ethilda, but we're going to save that for our athlete profile for 1920, so you can look forward to that next week. Other standout members of the team included Irene Guest, who is in the International Swimming Hall of Fame, Frances Schroth, who also won 3 medals, and Margaret Woodbridge, who was a national champion.
That's awesome.
Yeah. In women's diving, gold was won by the USA's Eileen Riggin, with teammate Helen Wainwright taking silver. The two were only 14 years old at the time, and since there were only 4 competitors in the event, all from the US, the US got a podium sweep. Diving was still in its infancy, so at this point, divers were expected to do both the 1 meter and 3 meter springboard in this event, and then they had their scores added together, which so fascinating because that's so different than what we see today.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. 2 of their dives were drawn by lot, and these were disclosed to the competitors just before the competition. So they did not have time to practice for these surprise dives.
That's kind of bonkers.
Pretty exciting.
Yeah.
It sounds like a very suspenseful event.
Yeah. I mean, I almost get a picture of they walk up to the springboard and they pull a move out of a hat. Like, okay, this is what you have to do now. But it's probably...
Good luck to you.
Yeah. For safety's sake, it's probably best that we don't do that anymore.
Definitely.
And on that note of diving, I have to dive into an apology because here we go again, having to issue another correction about tug of war. So
I know. People cannot believe it.
Yeah.
It's crazy that we get stuff wrong sometimes.
Yeah. So I know we said 1912 was the last time there was tug of war, and I'm learning that I can't trust everything I read on the internet, right? I mean, here I am in my late 30s and I'm just learning this lesson. So yeah, the internet was wrong and we were wrong yet again. And that's what we get, as you said, for not knowing everything. But in 1920, tug of war did feature for the last time, for real. Okay, I promise this time. And the British team ended up winning. The reason I can promise that this was the last time was because I finally did my due diligence and I looked ahead to the 1924 games to make sure that tug of war was not on the event list. And sure enough, it was no longer there. So I can definitely confidently say now this was tug of war's final official appearance, at least for now, unless they bring it back. Now, one thing I didn't know before, and one reason I'm grateful that I was wrong about this in the previous episode, was because it allowed me to learn about a little bit of a scandal, Sarah. So apparently back in 1908, there had been some controversy around the tug of war event. There was actually a complaint that was filed by the American team about the British police team who had won. The complaint was that the British team was wearing illegal weighted boots that gave them better traction. So I completely had not heard this story when we covered 1908 and was fascinated to hear that there was some major tug of war drama happening. So, you know, I figured since we had to issue a correction, might as well throw it into this episode here, and it helps explain why they got rid of tug of war after this.
Yeah. It was truly a war.
Yes, it was. Okay, so we talked about U.S. women and how they dominated the swimming here. They really, even though people meant the term mermaids as derogatory, they owned it, they dominated. But what was happening over in the men's events? So
in the men's event, we had Duke Kahonamoku of the United States set a world record in the 100-meter freestyle. Duke was a native Hawaiian who was born just a few years before the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1893, and later on became a U.S. citizen after Hawaii became a state. He actually won a gold at the 1912 Games in the 100-meter freestyle. In 1920, he won 2 golds in the 100 and the 4x2 meter freestyle relay. What he's more famous for, though, is for popularizing the sport of surfing after his Olympic career. And of course, we saw surfing finally join the Olympic program only 100 years later. he also had a career in Hollywood. And in 1925, he used his surfboard to rescue 8 fishermen from a capsized boat. So yeah, real life hero. In all, he won 5 Olympic medals between 1912, 1920, and 1924, and is a member of the U.S. Olympic Hall of Fame. And I'm going to add a little personal tidbit in here.
Yeah.
So a lot of people probably have heard of Duke and don't even know it, because if you go to Hawaii, or even I know San Diego because of personal experience, you have probably seen advertisements, at least advertisements, for a little chain of restaurants called Duke's. And it's a wonderful restaurant. But this is actually how I got to know who Duke was, because a few years ago I was in Hawaii and I was like, what is Duke's restaurant? And I looked it up and sure enough, it's a restaurant that is dedicated to him. And so in the couple of places that I've been in where I've been to a Duke's, which like, it's not like a Hard Rock Cafe where it's like this, you know, like the food's subpar, but it's cool to see a picture of a guitar. But it was actually really good food. And they have stuff about him and his story on the walls and all that. So just saying, if you've ever seen an advertisement or something for Duke's, that's this Duke.
And also, if you want to learn more about Duke and his life and his influence in both swimming and surfing, our friends over at the podcast Keep the Flame Alive actually had a fairly recent episode about Duke, and they had the author of one of the biographies about him on the show to talk about it, and the PBS documentary that was done. So yeah, we're not going to be profiling him, because honestly, if you want to hear more about him, you should go listen to that episode and you should go watch that documentary. But yeah, definitely he made a huge impact on both of those sports. So he got to shine bright here in 1920. But on that note, let's go ahead and head over to fencing. So here in Antwerp, we saw Nato Nadi of Italy, who we mentioned back in 1912 Stockholm. So he had won a gold there, and then he really struck gold here in Antwerp, winning 5 gold medals, including in the team events. So the team included his brother Aldo, who also came away with 3 gold medals of his own because he was a part of those team events. And then Nadi was also Italy's flag bearer for the opening ceremony. He had won a medal for bravery during World War I, and after his Olympic career, he became president of the Italian Fencing Federation. So incredible legacy for Italy around fencing, and especially Nato Nadi.
Yeah. Moving on to shooting. So shooting events were held at an army camp, which kind of makes sense, actually. Swedish shooter Oscar Swan earned a silver in team double shot running team event to become the oldest Olympic medalist ever at the age of 72. As much as we would love to see that record broken, I'm not very confident that will happen. Not even for Oksana Chusovitina in gymnastics.
Yeah,
but,
he wasn't exactly a young gun, pun intended.
I like what you did there. Then there's Carl Osborne of the United States. Over his Olympic career, which spanned from Stockholm 1912 to Paris 1924, he won 5 golds, 4 silvers, and 2 bronzes, making him the most decorated Olympic shooter of all time and one of the most decorated Olympians, period. And so why has he been forgotten? Apparently, he was a man of few words. According to Total Olympics, a yearbook entry from the Naval Academy says he, quote, once made a speech of 10 words, but as his roommate fainted, he hasn't tried it since. Never known to show much excitement over anything. So this guy, I don't really know what to say about that other than, yeah, it's pretty astounding.
I love it. I kind of imagine him like the Ron Swanson of Olympic shooting.
Yes. I know.
Anyway,
I'm like, I wish that we knew more about him because I need his life story made into a movie.
yeah, there's not much dialogue in it, but
I know. I mean, one of the most decorated Olympians ever.
Yeah.
Like, come on.
Yeah, seriously. Anyway, sorry.
There's got to be something to talk about. Outside of the Olympics, Osborne was a captain in the U.S. Navy, serving from around 1907 to 1945 when he retired and settled in California. His record as the most decorated U.S. Olympian would stand until Mark Spitz tied up with him in 1972. So, I mean, that's a pretty long Navy career, too. So, again, this guy has seen a lot, done a lot. Come on, man. Give us something. Tell us a little more. But,
yeah. I
good
mean,
for him.
Yeah, long Navy career serving, our nation, but also most decorated U.S. Olympian for over 50 years. And it took Mark Spitz, the swimmer, to tie up with his record. Like, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Also from the U.S., we've got Willis Lee and Lloyd Spooner. Lee won 5 golds, 1 silver, 1 bronze, so 7 medals total, while Spooner won 4 golds, 1 silver, 2 bronzes, also 7 medals. Their mutual record of 7 medals in 1 games stood for 60 years. Lee was in 14 events total, so he medaled in half of them and was the most successful athlete of the 1920 games. Afterwards, he joined the U.S. Navy, a lot of Navy guys here, where he eventually became a vice admiral when he served in World War II and participated in the famous Battle of Guadalcanal. He died of a heart attack aboard the USS Wyoming off the coast of Maine in 1945 at the age of 57, just 10 days after the surrender of Japan.
That's tough.
That's so sad.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that he at least made it to the end of the war.
Yeah, agreed.
Like he knew it was coming. Also, Brazil won its first ever Olympic gold medal with Guilherme Paraense winning in the rapid fire pistol event. He also won a bronze in the team 50-meter free pistol event. All
right, so moving away from shooting, we're going to talk a little bit more about boxing, which we already mentioned, happening over there at the Antwerp Zoo. And we're specifically going to zero in on the light heavyweight category, which was won by Eddie Egan. So Eddie was born in a working class family in Denver, Colorado, but he had the smarts to go to Yale in 1921. Then he graduated from there and went over to Harvard Law School, no big deal. But then he dropped out of Harvard. But why did he drop out? Well, only because he was awarded a Rhodes Scholarship, just casual.
Happens to all of us.
Right, yeah. So anyway, guy had a lot of brains is what I'm getting at here. But apparently he was brains and brawn because he was known as a fierce boxer. And in Antwerp 1920, he won every single match by decision. Then he came back to defend his title in 1924, but he was knocked out in the first round. But Sarah, here's really what I want to get to with Eddie. A month before the Lake Placid Games in 1932, the U.S. bobsled team was in some serious trouble. They were the defending champs from 1928, but they had a member of the team drop out. Billy Fisk, who was the head of the bobsled team, called up his friend, Eddie Egan, and he said, "Hey, you want to learn how to bobsled?" And Eddie said, "Yeah, sure," with only 3 weeks to train with the team. But then, due to a blizzard, the first time Eddie ever sat in a bobsled was at Lake Placid. And then the team won gold anyway. So Eddie Egan, our boxer here, he's a 2-time gold medalist and with a gold medal in 2 different sports and in 2 different versions of the Olympics, Winter and Summer Games. In fact, he's the only person to win 2 golds in 2 different sports in Summer and Winter Games. And he was also one of the first 21 inductees into the U.S. Olympic Hall of Fame, which deserved is all I can say.
Yeah. Do we know, is this the first case that is of someone who crossed over from a summer sport to a winter sport? Because, now it's not uncommon for it to happen necessarily with like bobsled because they recruit so many track athletes. But do you know? Was this the first time?
Technically, it's not the first time because we'll talk about this when we get to Chamonix 1924. But since figure skating had previously been considered a summer sport as part of the Olympic Games, we do have someone over there who is considered a winter and summer medalist because of the changeover. Yeah, but Eddie's case is still a little unusual, obviously, because you don't just have different winter or summer games. You have a completely different sport. So definitely he gets some cred for that.
As he should, especially with a 3 weeks notice.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, wild story with, blizzard, last minute dropout, just jumping into the bobsled because his buddy asked him to. Again, I don't know that we could see that situation exactly playing out anymore, but it's fun that it happened for him.
Yeah. Moving on to archery. We've got to talk about Hubert van Ennis of Belgium. Van Ennis took up archery as a young boy. As a kid, he had a job delivering milk in a cart with his dog, which, precious. We love dogs. And when he was finished with his rounds, he would send his dog home alone so he could go off and practice. He first competed in Paris 1900, where he had won 2 golds and 2 silvers, making him the first Belgian to win a gold medal. Despite his success at Paris 1900, he did not attend 1904 or 1908. And then archery had been left off the program in Sweden in 1912.
Boo. Sorry.
I know. No, I agree. I was going to say, if you're not going to do it, we got to edit it in.
Yeah.
At Antwerp, he returned to the Olympics, but was now 54 years old. He won the 28 meter and 33 meter moving bird target events, silver in the 50 meter, 2 more golds in the 28 meter and 33 meter team moving bird target events, and then a final silver in the 28 meter team event. With his 6 golds total, he's still the most decorated Olympic archer and Belgium's top medalist, and still among the top 20 medalists of all time. Antwerp would be his second and final Olympic Games. Go out on top, Archery would disappear from the Olympic program after 1920 until 1972, but Hubert continued to participate all the way to the age of 95 when he passed away on November 25th, 1961. So imagine what his record could have been had archery not been left off the program in 1912. I feel like he would have just gone and gotten at least 5 more medals.
Yeah, seriously, you've got a 95-year-old guy still out there shooting arrows. That's pretty amazing. I have to say I'm a little surprised he didn't take his dog along with him, though, for training, because then his dog could have fetched the arrows for him and brought them back. It would have saved him a few steps, I think.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to lie. Whether the dog was going to be useful for fetching or not, I'm like a little offended that he just didn't take his dog with him. It's not like he's shooting a gun that makes a loud noise.
Yeah.
It's archery. So just don't shoot your dog and you're fine. So, take the dog.
Yeah.
Come on. But it's okay.
Well, it makes me wonder.
It's okay. He's still incredible.
Yeah. It makes me wonder if maybe he wasn't supposed to be off practicing archery. And so he would send the dog home, because then his parents would think, well, Hubert has to be around somewhere. The dog is here. So, and then that was kind of like a decoy, right? So he could get some practice shots in. But anyway, that's conjecture. I don't know. Now, we're going to briefly talk about sailing, because it's a really weird fact for these games, which is that there was a 12-foot dinghy race, which was held in the Netherlands instead of Belgium. And the reason for that was because there were only 2 competitors. They were both Dutch. So, yeah, that happened. And I don't have much more to say about it than that. So yeah, this, I guess, was our kind of one of our first occasions of an Olympic event happening somewhere else other than at the host city, is all I can think to say.
Yeah.
But anyway, we're going to sail past that weird fact and go ahead and talk about athletics, because we always have a lot happening there. So in the 100-meter event, we saw that being won by Charlie Paddock of the U.S., who I did not know until doing the research for this episode was born in Gainesville, Texas, which is not terribly far from where we are. Yes. So we have Texas represented finally here at the Olympic Games, at least from what I know of. Maybe there were other Texans before him, but yeah, good old Charlie Paddock. I did not know that he was from a few stones throw away from where I live.
Yeah, no, you best believe I'm going to be researching anything to do with him, so that the next time I drive through Gainesville, like, if there's a marker, if there's anything, I'm going to find it.
Yeah, you would have to think there's got to be a marker there. And I think of how many times I've just kind of passed through Gainesville and never, I knew who Charlie Paddock was, but had no idea he was from there. So I will have to be on the lookout for something there too, and drag my family along with me if there's something to go see there.
Yeah.
But anyway, just a little bit more about Charlie. So during World War I, he had served as a lieutenant in the Marines. And one of the things that's really interesting about his victory here in 1920 is during the race, he actually leapt at the very end of the race. And that's what put him across the line in first place. So there's actually video of this where you can kind of see him take this final big lunge at the very end and beat out the competition. And another thing that's interesting is he was the first 100-meter winner to be called the fastest man alive, which is a tradition for the 100-meter winner ever since. So he also won gold in the 4x100-meter relay and then silver in the 200-meter race. If you've seen Chariots of Fire, which we talked about in our special movie Wildcard episode, he's played in that movie by actor Dennis Christopher, since Paddock also competed at the 1924 Paris Games, where he won another silver in the 200-meter. During World War II, he re-enlisted and he was made a captain. But then, sadly, he died in a plane crash near Sitka, Alaska on July 21st, 1943. So, gone too soon, unfortunately. But, he made his mark on the world. So worthy to be remembered.
Definitely.
Yep, as the fastest man alive. So, but yeah, what else was going on in athletics?
Canadian runner Earl Thompson broke the world record in the 100-meter hurdles, becoming the first gold medalist in the event not from the United States. So, at least went to our neighbor up to the north. And again, that's our ethnocentric mentality coming out. But we own it, we understand, we know. At the 1920 Games, British runner Albert Hill was 35 years old, and during the war, he served in France for 3 years. Going into the Games, he was still dealing with a shin injury, and in the 800 meters, he was going to be up against two favorites, Earl Eby of the United States and Bevel Rudd of South Africa. In true Olympic underdog fashion, he took the gold. Gosh, we love an underdog.
Yeah.
Later on, during the final for the 1500 meter, it was raining cats and dogs to the point the track got super soggy, but he ended up taking gold there too. Antwerp 1920 also saw the debut of Paavo Nurmi, the Finnish runner who's considered by many to be the greatest distance runner of all time, after winning 9 golds and 3 silvers in his Olympic career. 5 of those medals, 3 gold and 2 silver, were won in 1920. Later, at the 1924 Summer Games, he'd go on to win gold in 5 of the 6 events he entered. Not too shabby.
Yeah, I mean, Paavo has a pretty incredible legacy, obviously, in long distance running. And, we talked about this a little bit before about the Finnish and just how strong they are in long distance running. So we're going to we're going to see them
Mm-hmm.
pop up again, including in the marathon right now. so, so let's talk a little bit about the marathon here in
We love the
1920.
marathon.
We do. So this particular marathon is known as the longest in Olympic history. This was before the distance was standardized, and this particular version of the marathon was 42.75 kilometers. So that's just over 26.5 miles for us here in the US. And speaking of the Finns, the 1920 Olympic marathon, so it was won by Hannes Kolamainen of Finland. And then, as we were just saying, talent for long distance, not only is that a Finnish thing, but apparently it just ran, ha ha ha, pun intended, in his family because he was one of four brothers who were actually famous for long distance events. In fact, Hannes, his brother Tatu, was also a competitor in the marathon event for 1920, and they trained together on a regular basis. In fact, four of the top finishers in the marathon were all, well, Finnish. So no surprise, we're talking a lot about them. Now, Hannes, let's talk about him a little bit more. He had already won 3 gold medals back in 1912 in the 5,000 meter, the 10,000 meter, and the individual cross country race. He was known as Smiling Hannes because he was always seen smiling and in a good mood, which I love that. I love a happy runner. And then between the Olympiads, he had immigrated to the US, but he was still representing Finland here, or back in 1912, and then here again in 1920, even though he spent some time here. So I guess he didn't become a citizen. I don't know the full story there. Regardless, Finland gets credit for him. Now, one of the favorites for this race was Chris Jitschum of South Africa. So, just in case you don't remember that name, he had been the silver medalist in the marathon back in 1912. And to be honest, I don't even know if we did mention him, but he was there at 1912. And around the midpoint of the race, Kolamainen took the lead as he and Jitschum had run together for almost 15 kilometers. Jitschum ended up having problems from a leg injury, and he ended up having to withdraw. So he was a DNF for the race. Now, by this point, Kolamainen was already pulling ahead, and his time of 2 hours, 32 minutes, 25 seconds was a world's best at the time. He and legendary distance runner Paavo Nurmi, who we were just talking about, they would later light the cauldron together when Finland would host the 1952 Helsinki Games. So that's fun that his people didn't forget about him.
Sweet.
They brought him back. They remembered his Olympic legacy. And then we have to talk about this guy again, Shizo Kanekuri of Japan. So you might remember from 1912, he was the runner who went quote unquote missing during the race. And he showed up here in 1920 Antwerp, but he was still listed as a missing person in Sweden because of him dropping out of the marathon and not reporting it to the officials. He ended up getting 16th place here in Antwerp, and yet was still listed as missing. And that's a pretty great finish for someone who's a missing person, I have to say.
Yeah, I'd say.
But yeah, still was listed as missing over in Stockholm. Now, one thing that's exciting about this marathon is we had some new nations competing in it that we haven't seen before. So Chile, Estonia, and India had competitors in the marathon. So that's really cool to see love of long distance running spreading around the world to new places. And speaking of Estonia in particular, since this was also their first Olympic Games, Yuri Losman of Estonia won silver, and Italy won its first marathon medal thanks to Valerio Ari winning bronze. So a lot of firsts happening. Sounds like it was a really fun marathon race. So thankfully, no major tragedies or anything too wild happening here.
Yeah, it seems pretty tame overall compared to some of the stories we've talked about before.
Yeah, definitely. So, some people may love that drama, and I have to admit I do too. But it's also nice to see when a race is run well. So,
yeah.
All right. It's finally time to kind of close things down a little bit and talk about the legacy of Antwerp 1920. So, as always, we're going to kick it off talking about the medal table. Sarah, how did things end up there?
Well, this was the first time the host nation did not win the most medals overall.
Oh.
I know. I think that's really interesting. The United States won 96 total, 41 were gold. Sweden had 68 medals, 22 were gold. Belgium had 44 total, 16 were gold. Great Britain had 43 total, 14 of which were gold. And France had 42 total, 9 of which were gold. The games closed on September 12th, and because the organizing committee went bankrupt during the games, no official report was ever made, though documents were archived at the Belgian Olympic Committee in Brussels. Still, the games were considered a success overall simply because they happened. The IOC later acknowledged that the games had provided a valuable lesson about the impact of the expense of the Olympics, and that, quote, how expensive it was to host the games, and that it's imprudent to undertake them without having the necessary capital in hand. Still trying to learn that lesson, though, aren't we? Again, some of the things revolving around Antwerp 1920 hit a little close to modern day. Coubertin, of course, had to chime in. He had his own summary for Antwerp. He delivered to the IOC during a town hall with King Albert in attendance. He said, "This is what the 7th Olympiad has brought us. General comprehension. The certainty of being henceforth understood by all. These festivals are above all festivals of human unity." So at least he didn't trash the women that were competing.
Well, not in front of King Albert,
at least not that's written down here.
Yeah, we don't know what all was said, but there you go. Yes, they apparently were considered a success just because they happened, and with all the problems that they were facing, it is a bit of a small miracle that they did happen this soon after the war with so little preparation time. Again, that's going to be a bit of a theme that comes back after World War II. We will get there, but I am glad that they happened and that it brought the tradition back and that there were so many countries that were willing to participate, considering everything the world had gone through in the preceding years. So while the Olympics and Paralympics themselves are indeed about unity, as we mentioned before, the growing movement is going to need to break into two pieces, summer and winter, which would both be hosted in France for 1924. So this is going to be fun, getting to break it up into two pieces. I think we're both looking forward to that. And you're going to hear more about that in some upcoming episodes. But if you enjoyed this episode,
and we really hope you did,
then we hope you'll come back for our athlete profile on Ethelda Blytree, who we mentioned earlier. And I promise you don't want to miss hearing about her. Her life story is really cool. But until then, I'll see you later. The Games Odyssey podcast is a production of Wardrobe Media, LLC. This episode was written, hosted, produced, and edited by Jonathan Jordan and co-hosted by Sarah Patton. Show notes, including research sources and transcripts, can be found on our website, gamesodyssey.com. Olympic is a trademark of the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, USOPC. Any use of Olympic in the Games Odyssey podcast is strictly for informational, commentary, and educational purposes. The Games Odyssey podcast is not an official podcast of the USOPC and is not sponsored, endorsed, or officially affiliated with the USOPC or the International Olympic Committee or International Paralympic Committee. The content of Games Odyssey podcast does not reflect the opinions, standards, views, or policies of the USOPC, and the USOPC in no way warrants that content featured in the Games Odyssey podcast is accurate.